chocolate cake. We will start as planned at 3:30, which is, I guess, right now. So, my name is Priyanthi Fernando. I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. Good afternoon and welcome to this conference, 70 years after Bandung, Challenges and Struggles on the Road to Self-Determination and South-South Solidarity. The Bandaranaike Center for International Studies is very privileged to co-host this conference with the International Development Economics Associates, IDEAS, and Yukthi. And on behalf of all my colleagues at the BCIS, I wish to warmly welcome all the speakers and the participants who will be with us today and tomorrow. We have with us a very exciting group of Global South speakers from Brazil, Chile, Senegal, Palestine, Tanzania, South Africa, India, and China, as well as speakers from Sri Lanka, from SOAS, and from Progressive International. It is not always that we have the opportunity to listen to such geographically diverse thinkers from the Global South. And I just want to thank all of you for making the time to come to Colombo and to share your thoughts with us. So thank you very much and welcome to Sri Lanka. Bandung, 1955, happened in my lifetime. I'm conscious that for many of you it is an event from history. I was just 2 years old at that time, but I was considerably older when Sri Lanka hosted the 5th Non-Aligned Summit in Colombo in August 1976, here in these premises of the BMICH, not in BCIS, but in the big hall, under the leadership of Prime Minister Sirimavo Bandaranaike, who is also the founder and the inspiration for the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. So there are many, many reasons for organizing this meeting here in this campus. And there are some of us who here today who can share their personal experiences of this event. Dr. 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒔 told us the other day that she was a lowly usher at the in the BMICH hall. Our chairperson, Madam Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumartunga, mentioned that she acted as the French language interpreter for her mother, Mrs. Sirimavo Bandaranaike. My father's sister, my aunt, Mrs. Manela Besekara, was the chief of protocol in the foreign ministry at that time, and I could regale you with many of her stories about the different heads of state that participated in the event, stories that didn't get into any official communique. My own personal memory is of sitting on the pavement in Green Path, that is what is now called Ananda Kumarasamy Mawatha, watching the motorcade of all these famous people as they drove past from wherever they were accommodated. I believe some people, like President Tito of the former Yugoslavia, stayed on a ship, and they came down Green Path to the BMICH. And partly because this conference was such a major event in our historic calendar, and partly because of the role that our leaders played in the non-aligned movement, our memories of Bandung are closely and inextricably linked with the concept of non-alignment. But for me, the spirit of Bandung is a lot more than non-alignment. Though the non-alignment movement was an important outcome and depicted and was illustrative of the solidarity of the Third World from the late 50s through 60s and 70s. This was also a time when Sri Lanka was punching heavily above our weight. In addition to our leadership in the non-aligned movement, there was also our leadership in UNCTAD, in the Law of the Sea conferences, and our principled stance on disarmament, to name some of the global issues where, even though we are a small island state, we made our presence felt. Reading some of the blog posts from our esteemed speakers on the IDEA's website, I couldn't but help recall that during this time, there was an exciting intellectual discourse that underpinned the post-Bandung era, and how valuable some of those concepts and analytical frameworks were. And I was thinking, I would like to ask ourselves the question, what if we had not discarded these concepts? What if we resisted adopting whole-scale the ideologies of neoliberalism and the free market? What if we had built into our praxis the concepts that the Bandung spirit engendered, concepts of solidarity, cooperation, peace, disarmament? What if we had not all but abrogated our commitment to fundamental human rights and the principles of the UN Charter? And what if we had recognized, as the delegates at Bandung demanded, the equality of all races and all nations, large and small? Some historical what-if questions are purely rhetoric. How would things have historically panned out if something happened, if this happened? But what-if questions around the thinking and analysis, unlike what-if questions around events, are different, because these are concepts that we can actually resurrect and apply to what is happening in the world today. So obviously, solidarity and South-South cooperation are definitely concepts that we need to pull from the Bandung lexicon. Then there's the idea of coloniality, as well as the concepts of decolonization, anti-imperialism, etc. There is the theory of center and periphery that Professor 𝒔𝒕𝒉 has suggested can be used to understand the international division of finance. And we could also perhaps work on reclaiming the idea of world peace, formulating a new international economic order, another legacy of Bandung. And then, of course, there is also the idea of the commons, which is beginning to emerge in our conversations about alternatives and solidarity economies. I just want to end with another thought. We know that the 29 countries that came together in Bandung had very different political and social configurations, as well as histories and geographies. It is this same diversity that today is suggested as the constraint to global South solidarity. But despite that diversity, in Bandung, the countries had a unifying rallying call against the colonizers, against imperialism, and they demanded independence and self-determination. So as we go about our discussions on the spirit of Bandung, should we also be thinking about what our unifying rallying call could be? Inequality maybe, debt justice could be, but could it also be climate change and global warming, and the fact that the global north has made no effort to keep to the Paris Agreement? We know, for example, that small island states, especially in the Pacific, are coming together in what is for them an existential crisis. But can it not also be an issue that rallies together the less powerful nations of the global South? So this is a thought I would like to leave with you as we go into our 2 days of discussing the Bandung spirit. And with that, let me end my few introductory remarks and move us on to the next session. The next session, we will have a keynote speaker, Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, and that will be followed by a panel discussion with 4 of our visiting panelists. So can I first begin by inviting Professor Chandrasekhar, Aziz Salman Fall, Dr. Zhu Farva-Sial, and Dr. Bruno Mantarello de Conti to come up and take their seats on this table, on this podium, sorry. I'll sit here. So our keynote today is going to be given by Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, who I think many of you in this room might already know because he's no stranger to Colombo. He is the Global Director of Research and Policy at the International Development Economists Associates, which is IDEAS. He's also a senior research fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Professor Chandrasekhar was engaged in teaching and research at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, for more than 30 years. He is the author of numerous books, academic journals, and served as an advisor to various multilateral organizations, as well as public departments in India. I can think of no one with a better, who can better set the tone for our discussions these next 2 days. So, Professor Chandrasekhar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanti, and thank you to the organizers. I suppose I'm one of them too. Having invited me to speak this, to join this discussion today. I want to just lay out a few ideas which I think would be more in the form of a framework in which we can examine once again or revisit Bandung, as it were. Of course, part of the reason we are here is because we are, and as many others across the world, are marking the 70th anniversary of Bandung. And that is considered by many, even if not by all, as being a milestone in global history and definitely in the history of the global majority countries. And even though it was a meeting of leaders, it essentially was seen as an event which had the support and reflected the aspirations of a large part of the world's population located in countries which at the point of time had won for themselves independence from colonial rule. And that matters because of the fact that we must recognize that at that point of time, among the countries which featured it, or the leaders of countries which featured it at Bandung, were countries, leaders from countries in Asia and Africa, whereas Latin America, it appears, looking back, was in some sense absent, not because of the fact that it didn't have the same aspirations among its people and many leaders who actually followed that, but partly because of the fact that Latin America, I speculate, partly because of the fact that Latin America came out of colonial rule much earlier, that it was really in the early 19th century that many of those countries obtained independence. And therefore, this reflected the sort of spirit and the aspirations of people who had just won themselves independence through freedom movements, through national liberation struggles from colonial rule. Now, when people refer back to when we try to revisit Bandung, there are, I suppose, two aspects which we tend to consider, or at least some of us tend to consider. One, of course, is to really ask the question of what was the nature of the Bandung moment? I mean, what exactly was that moment like? And the other, of course, which is most spoken of, is what was the nature of the Bandung spirit? What exactly did it reflect? Now, the Bandung moment was actually, looking back, a very interesting one. It was an interesting one because it was a point of time in the history of capitalism where there was a hegemon who had complete control over global capitalism. Japan and Germany had been defeated very badly in the war. You had a country which, having come out of the war and escaped the Great Depression partly because of the war, had decided to adopt Keynesian policies, and therefore we entered what's called the golden age in American capitalism, where you had a capitalism which had low unemployment, relatively low rates of inflation and high growth, which was unprecedented in the history of what is known to be, and still is, a crisis-prone system. And it was also a moment in which, if we look at it, there was a sort of new confidence as far as global or imperialism was concerned. It was in that context, as it were, because of the wave of decolonization which had occurred, partly because of the weakening of the earlier imperial powers, America being the new imperial hegemon, that because of that you had this wave of decolonization, so that independent of the fact that there seemed to be some degree of confidence and strength at the core of capitalism, you had a set of countries which are willing to stand up and say that, listen, we actually think that colonialism is evil, and colonialism in all its manifestations. And I think that's important to recognize or to note in that declaration, that colonialism in all its manifestations is something which is evil and must be done away with. In fact, in his speech, President Sukarno at that point of time pleaded, he basically said that do not think that imperialism or colonialism only exists in its classic form. Rather, it comes in modern dress in various forms, and you actually have ways in which there is economic control, intellectual control, and physical control of a small alien population within all of our countries. So there was a fundamental, so it was a situation of having an imperialism which seemed to have a new confidence, and a hegemon who seemed to be in control, and yet a willingness for these countries which came together post-decolonization to express a degree of solidarity with each other and to stand up against colonialism in all its manifestations. Now that, of course, was the Bandung moment. And what was the Bandung spirit? Interestingly, we know all of the things which we normally speak of. It had this very strong anti-colonial stance. It spoke of the need for countries to come together and help each other. So there was a strong element of South-South solidarity, as it was being mentioned. There was, in some sense, a recognition that it's important to fight for the equality of nations, for sovereignty and territorial integrity, recognize each other's right to self-determination. So all of what constituted the political elements of the end of colonial rule and the coming of independence. But in some sense, what was missing in that declaration maybe were clear statements which would actually have sort of tied the battle for economic freedom to the battle for political freedom. Because all of those leaders, in some sense, or at least the major ones of them, Nehru, Nazar, many of them had recognized this and basically said that if we want to translate political freedom into something which is substantial and real, we need to actually get ourselves freedom from foreign capital and freedom from international markets which have subjugated us for such a long period of time. But there was, in some sense, some kind of a perception there. There was some reference, of course, to the need to stabilize commodity prices, etc., but some recognition of the need for such a strategy, but a recognition which was much more visible in the national strategies of these individual countries rather than in the Bandung Declaration itself, possibly because of the fact that it might have been felt that it was going to be difficult to get unanimity on what could be the appropriate strategy all countries should follow in the context of an exit from colonialism. Now, this, of course, this political solidarity, we know, led up to the formation of the non-aligned movement, the G77, etc. But in another sense, the economic sort of substance of that declaration of the need for independence was reflected finally in the battle to actually get ourselves, not that it has been successful, a new international economic order. It was sort of starkly reflected in the formation of UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which did work, which was amazing from the point of view of trying to put economic substance in the sort of effort to try and win economic freedom or economic independence in a real sense. Now, what is the current moment, or the current conjuncture, when we look at it in terms of the Bandung moment? The current conjuncture is so fundamentally different, because what we have is we have an imperialism in decline, a decline which is resulting in a kind of crude aggression both at the realm of diplomacy and economic policy, but also in the realm of wars of different kinds, either fought directly or in the form of proxy wars. It's a moment in which it appears that once again, after a long period of time, in which there seemed to be a sort of end to, if not a sort of softening of inter-imperialist rivalry, by imperialist nations were virtually together aligned in battles at the WTO and elsewhere against the developing countries, against the global majority. And it's also a period in which what had come to dominate thinking as far as what economic policy should be in the period after the 1980s, what we normally refer to as a neoliberalism, has lost its legitimacy. And it's lost its legitimacy not merely in the peripheral countries of the global south, but it has also lost its legitimacy at the core, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, which actually demonstrated that how deep inside this was a system which was inherently, fundamentally flawed, and leading up to a crisis which could have generated for us one more Great Depression. Now, this actually would suggest that this moment, as compared to the Bandung moment, would be one in which you would have a greater degree of strength and possibility of solidarity in the effort to take down imperialism in what seems to be a weak moment for imperialism. But we don't seem to find the same degree of solidarity. In fact, it is true that lots of institutions and individuals and organizations have marked 70 years of Bandung, but the celebrations have been sporadic and don't reflect the kind of joy and aspiration which was visible at the time of the Bandung moment. So what exactly happened? Obviously, we did not have a linear movement from the Bandung moment to the current conjuncture, and it's that transformation somewhere in between which generated a situation where, independent of the fact that we happen to be in a world when in some sense the third world can assert itself, particularly because of the fact that despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have at least two countries, which is China and Vietnam, having of course chosen at one point of time to go more market-friendly and target international markets, still have used the resilience which came out of the success of their national liberation struggles in order to generate what would be more egalitarian societies, to be successful even within what seems to be a sort of a market economy-oriented development strategy targeted at world markets. So in some sense it appears that there is a challenge. There is a new kind of plurality as opposed to the plurality which existed because of the fact that the Soviet Union was there at the time of Bandung. And it was a Soviet Union which of course was, even though it suffered so much in terms of losses during the Second World War, it was known, except for those who wanted to sort of conceal it, that this was a war. The war against fascism was actually won on the Russian front, on the Eastern Front. So it was a strong Soviet Union, not merely because of the fact that it had put all its people to work, but also because of the fact that it was crucial in the war, in the defeat of fascism, which was a consequence of inter-imperialist rivalry, which socialism itself was not really responsible for. Now, what really happened in terms of this linear moment? And I think what I'd like to suggest is that, in some sense, if you look at Bandung, at the core of Bandung was the idea that what matters most is the nation state and the governments which were representative of the people who constituted those nation states, which is why so much of emphasis on territorial integrity, on the right to self-determination, etc. So if we say that these governments of these nation states had before them at that point of time an agenda to convert political freedom into real economic freedom, what was that strategy? Of course, there were many versions of it. But at the core of that strategy was, to a certain extent, as far as possible, to de-link yourself from international markets through protectionism involving tariffs and quantitative restrictions, to controls on foreign capital inflows into these countries, an unwillingness to accept financial flows, and of course, in most countries also an effort to try and put the state at the center of a development strategy which will allow economic diversification of a kind which will reduce your dependence on international capital and technology, and therefore give you the economic freedom and independence which would consolidate and make meaningful the political independence that you had. Now, we know that by the time we got to the middle of the 1970s, despite remarkably good rates of growth in many of these countries relative to what they they recorded during the colonial period, when many of them in fact saw either stagnation or even retrogression, that by the time we got to the 80s, somehow the promise which many of these countries displayed in terms of the willingness of these governments to take up these independent strategies didn't get realized. And I think at the core of that was the inability of these states, having put at the center the state or the government and the nation state, to be able to ensure that they would be able to generate for themselves, either individually or through solidarity and cooperation, the markets needed for them to be able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And why was that? That was because of the fact that if you want to grow your market, in the final analysis, you must be willing to attack asset inequality. You must be in a position to deal with land monopoly and break land monopoly through radical land reform. And almost every one of these governments which attended, or the leaders of which attended Bandung, had this in their programs, that we need to do these things. We need land reforms. It was a period in which there was a huge literature on the implementation of land reforms and the challenges to that. But what we did have is that other than in a couple of countries, two of which I just mentioned, which is China and Vietnam, there are not many countries in which we actually saw the implementation of this agenda of dealing with asset inequality and the income inequality which comes with that. Because if you don't deal with that, you cannot create the mass markets to be able to generate the growth needed to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Now, if we say that that is the reason, in part, we had a failure, that you were not able to do this, maybe there was something to a view, and I think I'll then wrap up after that, there's something to a view which is expressed, though because of Stalin being involved and so on, very often we don't go back to these things. But at the 6th Congress of the Communist International, there was an idea, and the idea was that, listen, unless national liberation struggles are led by the workers and the peasants, by the working people of countries, whose interests the governments which come to power will serve, you're actually not going to have a successful transition even within the framework of capitalism. And the reason given for that was that if you actually had other elements, say the capitalist class, you would end up with a situation where they would compromise with the landed interests, with feudalism, because of the fact that ever since actually the Paris Commune, but definitely since the October Revolution, there was a fear among the elites and the asset owners of these countries. There was a fear that any effort to undermine land monopoly could translate itself into a movement against private property itself. And therefore, while you had this notion that you wanted to have this program which dealt with asset inequality, in practice it rarely got implemented. And therefore, you ended up with a situation where this effort to grow your own domestic market and win yourself the independence from an extremely unequal international order didn't really get realized. So therefore, if you're really looking at, what do we want at this conjuncture? What do we want at a point of time when it's not a Bandung kind of moment, but on the other hand, it's a moment with much opportunity because of the fact, as I said, that on the one hand, there is this weakness, this loss of legitimacy, not merely of the core, but also of capitalism and neoliberalism itself. But on the other hand, we don't see the kind of push, except in a few countries, and sometimes they don't last for long. We don't see the push. What are we looking for? And I think it's important to go back to Bandung and I think get back a core idea that it had, which is that if you want a bulwark against imperialism, it just cannot be only the people. It has to be a state which represents the interests of the people who want to stand against imperialism. I think this is crucial. And therefore, when we are actually trying as democratic forces, as progressive intellectuals, as civil society actors, as we try and ask ourselves what should we do in order to be able to revive that Bandung spirit, which in some sense is flagging, then I think what is most important in all of these countries is for these actors to be able to institute states which reflect the will and the desires and the aspirations of the people and can constitute the actual bulwarks against imperialism. And that's what I hope all of us stand for today. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Chandrasekhar. That was a very thoughtful and provocative keynote. We are not going to take any questions after a keynote. Neither are our other panelists actually going to respond directly to what the issues that Professor Chandrasekhar raised. But we will ask each of them to add or build on some of the ideas that he actually shared with us. So we will go in a certain order. We will start with Dr. Aziz Salman Fall, who's from Senegal. He will talk to us first for about 10 minutes. He is a political economist, a member of GRILA, G-R-I-L-A, Research and Initiative Group for the Liberation of Africa, and of the Third World Forum. He's a coordinator of the international campaign Justice for Sankara, president of the internationalist SERFA. Dr. Fall also teaches at the University of Quebec in Montreal and McGill University. Member of the ad hoc executive secretary of the International Workers and Peoples. Co-founder of the MAG movement des Assises de la Gauche in Senegal, and leader of the progressive Pan-African platform Son Egal. Sorry for murdering those French words, but Aziz Salman Fall, the floor is now yours. I was explicitly asked not to call him doctor, so I'm finding it quite difficult to not do that. Sorry.
Okay. So, the structure. Okay. Greeting everyone. So I'm really delighted to be in Colombo among distinguished comrades, Your Excellency, Dr. Chandrasekhar. I just can't agree more on everything you have said. I would like to extend to you the fraternal greetings of the members of GRILA and SERFA, and thank you for the honor of taking part to this important meeting. During these days, we will try to immunize ourselves against the virus of fascist, racist, and culturalist thought and neoliberal and imperialist practice by closing our ranks, because its hegemony obscures and pollutes the horizon of the world and make us believe that we cannot act and that its order would be unsurpassable. It is difficult to counter the enemy of the world it imposes and open doors to hope. As Professor have expressed, the demand and the measures that arose from the non-aligned movement of Bandung constituted in the Cold War era a middle pathway of nationalism, defending independence, development, and democracy. They were clearly advancement of national bourgeois or petit bourgeois interest, and the essential elements are still important through considerably without breath. The plundering of the global South's resources to the benefit of mainly the North has destroyed development prospects for all our countries and generated pauperization, rarefaction, and destabilization. Since the rejection of the demand for a new international world order in 1973-74, and despite many initiatives, the country of the periphery has been exposed to the debt issue, the debt option, to compradorization, and then to the coercion of the neoliberal and financialized market. This considerably watered down the Bandung dream and accentuated the dispersal of the itineraries of social formation, which buried the potential for radicalism that could still exist, however, among the non-aligned, not only the states, but above all the struggles of peoples and nations. To overcome the difficulties of integration into the world economy, free trade agreements and all sorts of regional arrangements have been tried out in the Global South, with very little internal South-South integration in reality. In the current state of disarray and expectation, and without nostalgia, a lucid response from the organic forces of the Global South is inexorably becoming aware of its anti-systemic potential. This presupposes recovering the state's room for maneuver, rediscovering the organizational potential of peoples and the coherence of the convergence of transversal struggles beyond sovereignty against transnationals, war, and the rapacity of the market, and in defense of the equal status of women and the protection of the common good and the environment. This is not a time for nostalgia and mere commemoration, but for understanding that the non-alignment must have the courage to align themselves against imperialism and reinvent what I call a trans-internationalism of peoples. If the latter accept the leadership of the industrial champions of the Global South, mainly the BRICS, it rejects their sub-imperial temptation and reached out to the people of the core countries to also fight barbarism. I propose trans-internationalism starting from the Global South first, so that once it has crystallized, and without sub-imperialism, it can irradiate the people of the North, whose interests are not so opposed to ours, confronted as they are with the rigors of their uniformizing economic, cultural, educational, and political standards and system. Universality, however, will only exist with other homeomorphic and indigenous equivalent. Homeomorphic is just all the values that Panikkar has expressed. Sometimes it's referred to religion, but we are looking on the other conception of human right, other conception of development that may exist in India, China, or Africa. So this is the condition that would probably irrigate, and when hegemony fades through fertile and reciprocal acculturation. The Global South must also take back the epistemic initiative and restore the sense to participate in an uninhibited construction and a non-Eurocentric reconstruction of knowledge. We need to deconstruct the Eurocentrism embedded in our cognitive frames that are deeply enmeshed in our thoughts and practices of knowledge. This epistemic issue is eminently political. It is articulated in the effort at redeployment offered by trans-internationalism. By trans-international, I mean the extra-state and national dimension, both infra- and supranational, which incorporates progressive internationalism, mainly those of workers and the jobless, ecologists, and feminists. So we are going beyond the first internationalism and adapting it to the 21st century to its equivalent in different parts of the world in order to achieve real universalism. Trans-internationalism makes it possible to incorporate internationalism, which itself went beyond the national question by advocating workers' solidarity, transcending it to deploy politically, socio-culturally, and psychologically a progressive rearguard and vanguard front of the organic forces to meet the challenge of the 21st century and beyond. Our struggle goes back a long way, and I think Professor have expressed how all these struggles were important. It started for us in the famous League of Anti-Imperialists that was in 1927 in the Congress of Berlin, and also to refer to that very noxious atmosphere of the Spanish War, which was very similar to the one we are enduring today, created chaos in the spirit of the return of the Brown Plague. 10 years after Bandung, more than 500,000 Indonesian allied to President Sukarno were exterminated for their real or presumed membership of the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia. Just a few months earlier, in 1965, Sukarno slammed the door on the UN in protest at Malaysia's entry into the Security Council and launched a new rising force, believing he could revive the Bandung momentum from the Hanoi, Phnom Penh, Beijing, Jakarta, Pyongyang springboard. Imperialism fanned the flames of hatred against the communists and plunged the country into pogrom by Muslim fundamentalists and conservatives under the so-called New Order, pale imitation of the Japanese imperial dictatorship. 10 years after Bandung, the country that hosted it sounded the death knell for the progressive third world movement. The other issue that is still around, and it's a pity is coming back, is the issue of race. The prejudice about race and racial myths and about alleged backwardness and incompatibility with civilization, early denounced by Antonin Firmin, persist in coloniality that even today demands a change in our paradigms and power relations. This is exactly what Hannibal Quijano is expressing in the issue of coloniality. On the coloniality of power and the colonial modern matrix, he explained that this coloniality of power has proved to be more durable and more deeply rooted than the colonialism itself that it has engendered, and which it helped to impose globally. We have to question even the development issue. Development in German is Entwicklung. It is a Western belief. We have to look at something that I would call a more balanced dynamic, a more equilibrium type of development. And it's important to reflect on how we can contribute to debunk and reinvent this issue of development. Everywhere, the struggle to preserve equality or to increase inequality continues. The balance of power is political, and depending on the worldview and the period, gives rises to increasingly sophisticated superstructures to resolve issues of wealth, power, and meaning. It is up to us, in the exceptional historic moment of redeployment of imperialism in the 21st century, to help complete the effort of so many people who have fought for our freedoms and our development. The leaders and forces of resistance in these countries were fighting for decolonization and against the persistence of neo-colonial rule. And despite of their effort and the fact that it was impossible to remain neutral in the East-West conflict, their position was quite clear in the face of imperialism. I don't have time to express all the elements I have in my paper regarding international cooperation, South-South cooperation, and even recently the debate that happened in Brazil with also the issue of the high-level committee on South-South cooperation. But I just want to end with 2-3 things. First, the advent and progress of BRICS is likely to revolutionize South-South cooperation as well as our living condition, and perhaps revise the architecture of international regulation if the South is united and if its people ensures that the elite of the country leading this grouping do not reinvigorate capitalism. It is up to us at this very exceptional moment when imperialism is being redeployed to contribute to complete all the effort that were made by the past generation. We need to repoliticize our societies that were depoliticized during the neoliberal era, particularly for the youth. We, the people who were not founded on the basis of accumulation, profit, and the ownership of nature and people, and who have instead been the victim, should articulate a different conception of development that I call dynamic balance. Probably some of you have not heard of the Bamako Declaration and its principles. There are 8 principles. You can look at it on the internet. But I think even though it was in 2005 and 2006, principles are still accurate as the principle of Bandung. First is building a world on solidarity between human beings and peoples, building a world based on the full affirmation of citizen and gender equality, building a universal civilization in which diversity in all fields is given its full creative potential, building socialization through democracy. Neoliberal policies seek to impose a single mode of socialization, building a world based on the recognition of the non-market status of nature, the planet's resources, and agricultural land, building a world based on the recognition of the non-market status of cultural products and scientific knowledge, education, and health, promote policies that closely link democratization without predefined limits, and affirming the solidarity of the people of the North and the South in the construction of an internationalism and an anti-imperialist basis. Like I have expressed it already in Bandung, the challenge of an anti-systemic response based on the spirit of Bandung should consider the feminist, ecological, and progressive challenge at the heart of the analysis aimed at democratically repoliticizing peoples with a view to an upsurge in the defense of the commons and an alternative to capitalism. It presupposes a critique of the development as a Eurocentric belief and a non-culturalist emphasis on the validation of other functional epistemes in order to build a universalism of people. Whereas over these last decades, national sovereign space have been considerably destabilized by arbitrary, unjust practices and the authority of big financial institutions, whether public or private. Whereas war, even a global war, is the choice implemented by the senile troika to reproduce their world order that is globally rejected by the wide majority of world population. Whereas the negative socio-political and ecological consequences of these measures will take decades to stamp out in our country. Whereas the regulatory mechanism that exists globally, whether multilateral or otherwise, to protect the commons have become archaic or inoperable. Whereas meeting of agglomerated coalition like the World Social Forum, through important, make it difficult to carry out and structured anti-imperialist work. And whereas the era of the West-East bipolarization of the world has taken different shape, mainly targeting Russia and China, and that of North-South persists like imperialism, but in more sophisticated form. And when also the scattering of state of the South has exhausted the potential of the group of the 77, given all this substantial gain in the left in Latin America, the brakes that have been placed on the uprising in North Africa, the breakthrough in the Sahelian states, the spread of populist and far-right values, but also the disarray of the left and the great need for a democratic repoliticization, it is important to build on the historical struggle that have been fought and to more broadly work on others in order to translate the genuine credential of our people. So the development of a three-continental internationalist political platform of convergence is very crucial. That's what I call Bandung Second, the new era of the aligned movement. An aligned movement against imperialism will be a second decisive step towards affirming democratic and popular sovereignty. Here, it will be important to firmly complete the gains of the preceding era and affirming an alignment with nation-state, popular movement, social groups, political parties, association, individuals on the basis of internationalism in this specific condition. Bandung Second will provide a roadmap for a societal project in a polycentric world where popular forces of the South, fed up with the North-South monologue, are proposing to reorient globalization toward a development that is truly about balance, social justice, protecting Mother Earth's well-being, proper conduct, and attitude. Faced with the redeployment of imperialism, the resilience and response of the progressive global South and of internationalists remain scattered. The irreversible depletion of the ecosystem and the threat to human reproduction are amplifying the culturalist withdrawal and the resurgence of populist and fascist expression. This Capitalocene is bogged down in crisis and is on the way to depleting humanity. That's why I will end up with this sentence of our dear comrade Samir Amin. In our time, given the destructive power at the disposal of the powers that be ecological and military destruction, there is a real risk denounced by Marx in his days that fighting will destroy all the opposing camps. The second path, on the other hand, requires a lucid and organized intervention of the internationalist front of workers and people. Thank you.
Much, Aziz Fall. I think you had a very interesting counter, in a way, to the kind of conversation we were having earlier with Professor Chandrasekhar about the complicity of elites in perpetuating a world failing capitalist system. And I think the kind of ideas you proposed about knowledge imperialism and the need to actually activate people and then workers and people is, I think, a very important perspective of that. Hold your questions because we will come to them eventually. The next speaker is... Let's see, who's the next speaker? Is 𝒂𝒓𝒔 𝑨𝒐𝒖𝒕𝒉. She is the Asia Regional Director of Research and Policy at IDEAS. She's also a research associate in the Department of Economics at SOAS in London. So, Farah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being with us today and giving us your time. I also want to thank Yukthi and BCIS for collaborating with IDEAS for this event. And of course, being in this very historic venue is of great importance to us. Before I start, I also want to thank 3 brilliant young women who've made this event possible. So Suhaina, Shafia, Yathursha, without them, nothing would have been possible. So thank you so much. So the year is 2025, and here we are commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. This is also the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, and it's been 77 years since the Nakba, which of course is ongoing. And just last week was the Remembrance Day for the genocide in Namibia. And this was the first time that this genocide was commemorated by Namibia, because only in 2021 did Germany accept the label or the term genocide. So today, as we remember Bandung, a period of hope, we are equally forced to remember the genocides of the past. But of course, we are in the midst of an ongoing genocide in Palestine. And the forgotten genocides of the past and the present are an indelible reminder of what preceded liberal capitalism, and what, of course, has always underscored the facade of civility and civilization of liberal capitalism. The contemporary end of the liberal order is also a stark reminder that the carpet bombing of an entire nation for 650 plus days can continue without any impunity, without any repercussion. Given this background, I will focus on 2 things in my very short talk. The first is on how to reinterpret the Bandung Conference and how to read the current order. So let me just repeat a few things that Professor Chandrasekhar and Dr. Aziz already mentioned, which is the first, that the fragility of the Bandung movement. You know, a fact which stands out historically is that the Bandung movement and the period leading up to the new international economic order was led by a handful of countries which were at very nascent stages of their existence. So India, Indonesia, Communist China had been independent for no more than a few years. And these countries were involved in reconfiguring a very delicate balance of international order in which colonialism was still the stronghold. So the Algerian War of Independence was going on, the Korean War had just finished, and the Second Vietnamese War was on its way. And the fragility of these newly independent states was also then followed by really big assaults. You know, Dr. Aziz Salman just hinted to that. But there were unsuccessful and successful coup attempts, as well as targeted threats to lives of the leaders of these countries. So think of President Nasir in Egypt, President Sukarno in Indonesia, and of course in some countries, coups and overt and covert political intervention did lead to ousting of the governments, like President Nkrumah in Ghana, and President Modibo Keïta in Mali. And since then, we see a cyclicality. Any country that attempts to exercise its economic sovereignty finds itself in the straitjacket of economic imperialism, debt, sanctions, austerity, privatization, and of course, regime change. This, for many, is considered the end or the failure of the Third World Project. And the emphasis is constantly on the failure of what these countries could do, right? But in my view, this is not enough. I think it does not grasp what imperialism is really all about. And it does not understand the ruthlessness of the US-led order. And it's an avoidant analysis because it's framed in a Eurocentric vision of how our world is constantly changing, but some facts are highlighted and others are not. So there is no such thing as dollarization without violence, without military threat, without permanent chaos. And we have Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and now Syria as examples. So to discard the hope that Bandung presented is a myopic view of history, and I think a sanguine or optimistic view of what imperialism is all about. And given the nature, brutality, and immiseration of the people of the Global South, to say that Bandung was a hope is not enough, because we then also have to counter for the numerous social upheavals in Zimbabwe, in Venezuela, in mass struggles in Latin America and the Caribbean, to show that there has been no stagnancy in responses to imperialism. Given this, I come to my second point with this understanding of Bandung as a moment which continues to hold relevance for the Global South and which led up to many events and social upheavals and continued protests and mobilization. I want to come to my second point, which is how should we read the current order? And the question really is, what does the end of the liberal order mean? And I think the answer is that the facade that there is a need for permission is over. And here I don't simply mean that the regalia and show of the international law is over. This is undoubtedly the case. We see that there is no longer pretense on any front in the incapacity of the International Court of Justice and the UN. What I really mean is that the liberal order is concurrently accompanied by the rise, escalation, and deepening of militant struggles around the world. We have two major examples here, and one is in the Middle East and also in West Africa. So the crystallization of previously loose regional coalitions led by Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, and Palestine, known as the Axis of Resistance, is an evolving militant struggle centering Palestine, but also focused on the sovereignty of these countries and the future of these countries. Similarly, the Alliance of Sahel States in West Africa, constituted by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, with prospective entry by Chad, center anti-imperialist struggles against France, but also address the question of anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism in my view. The point that needs emphasis is that the character of these militant struggles will shape the dialectic of the new order. And I say this because we do talk about very important or crucial policies such as dollarization, de-dollarization. We talk about the BRICS and multipolarity. We talk about the potential of a new credit rating agency coming from Africa, and the rise of new coalitions, sometimes clinging to the UN or sometimes beyond the UN. But we often don't try to understand what's happening at the militant struggle level. And unlike the Bandung Conference, which was a coalition of various forces which were sometimes contradictory, I think the evolving nature of current militant struggles need to be understood in the question that they're raising, which is not for a different model of capitalist surplus distribution, but actually against the capitalist value production itself. This, as I said, remains evolving, but the character of this needs to be compared to what we had before us, and then move forward. So, this is not an intellectual debate, I have to emphasize, but one which hinges on national liberation and national actually planetary and generational survival at the moment. So in other words, what I'm saying is that since violence is no longer coded in economic policies, but naked in its assault, our energies must be focused on a broader notion of resistance, historically grounded in the shadow of resistance in the Algerian, Haitian, and Vietnamese War of Liberation. And this indeed is a principle of Bandung movement, which underscores, and I quote, nations have the right to defend themselves, either individually or collectively, as outlined in the UN Charter. And of course, a related point to the rise of militancy is what I think is very well known in Sri Lanka, which is that the majority of the global south is in a state of emergency. Coming out of one of the greatest global pandemic, which was COVID, extreme indebtedness, rising energy prices, rising food prices, and complete subordination to the international or abstract capital markets means that there is a future full of unrest, violence, and disorder. And as states become empty vessels with hordes of climate migrants seeking security, the problem is actually globalized and no longer one which borders conceal. So based on this, to conclude and remember the Bandung movement, I think there are just two choices for the future ahead of us. A future with socialism built for humanity and human survival, or a future with capitalism which is built for fascism, and the reproduction of unimaginable violence which we see unfolding before us. And I think as people of Global South, we must first unlearn what the liberal order taught us, and then relearn our own histories of national liberation, militant struggles, and build solidarity across the countries of the Global South. Thank you.
Thank you, Fava, for raising the whole issue of violence, militarism, and structural violence as well. So thank you so much for doing that. We have next Dr. Zhu Zhu, who is from the Sun Yat-sen University in China, on leave from John Jay College. He has taught Marxist political economy in China and the US, and he is on the editorial boards of Science and Society and the Journal of Labor and Society. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, in this very historical building, to participate in this very important meeting commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. Again, thanks to Ms. Yanthi Fernando. I also greatly enjoyed listening to Professor Chandrasekhar and the comments by Dr. Aziz Fall and Dr. Fawasile. Let me first mention one thing, that since we're talking about the Bandung Conference, the Bandung Declaration, if you have the packet, information packet, which has the 10 points of the Bandung Conference, if you read it, I think the natural reaction is, well, it's nothing. I mean, it's very general. The Bandung Conference produced a rather generic document where it more or less reproduces the United Nations charters that the countries agreed to in 1945. So in that way, we have to understand the Bandung Conference as a very important one, a very progressive conference, yet at the same time, it was also conservative in its nature. It didn't say much. It didn't make much big comments, projections on what will happen to the world. Nothing. And there is a good reason for that. When I say that it's great to be here in Colombo, it directly, I was talking about the 1954 Colombo Power Conference here, right here in this city, where the leadership from 5 countries from Sri Lanka, obviously, from Burma or Myanmar, from India, Indonesia, and Pakistan. The leaders of the 5 countries got together in this city, and they discussed what shall be the way forward. One of the things out of the discussion was a preparation for a major conference a year later in 1955. So this was the place where the Bandung Conference was conceived, was prepared for. Now, as you can imagine, all those 5 countries had many, many differences. There are many conflicts, territorial claim conflicts, ideological differences. Even among those 5 countries, none of them was ruled by a communist party. Nonetheless, they had important differences. And if you add China, obviously, after the Chinese Revolution, it was under a very different ideology. So it was very hard for the 29 countries gathering in Bandung in Indonesia to talk about a lot of issues. And this was the reason why those leaders eventually arrived at such a document which really didn't say much. But that itself is significant. The very fact that they can get together, they sit together, and as the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai at the time said, we, representing China, we come here not to make arguments. We are trying to make friends. And that is the spirit of the Bandung Conference. We try to find common grounds. At the same time, we maintain our differences. Otherwise, we will be divided and conquered by Western powers who were at the time watching the conference very closely. So I think in that sense, we should realize that it's very difficult to do such a conference, even in the 1950s. And it was not in any way necessarily easier than today to think about this. I mean, at the time, people were worrying about the coming World War III in the 1950s. And now, obviously, we had some similar worries, but it's not necessarily harder or easier. Let me also mention the next thing. At the time of the conference, the leadership broadly divided the countries into 2 groups. One is the so-called nationalist group, led by national bourgeoisie, independent movements, and the other was the socialist group, which had a more radical program. Something that Professor Chandrasekhar today mentioned, said, if the newly independent government didn't have the political momentum, didn't have the courage, didn't have the support to carry out radical reforms, such as land reform, they will face a small internal market. That is very true. But let me add that for countries like China, where we have nationwide massive land reform, it was very successful. So the internal market in that sense was there. But because of the radicalness, because of this revolutionary moments, it was blocked by the entire Western camp. China suffered sanctions, blockade from the West, the Paris Committee. It was the containment policy or containment strategy targeting all those countries affiliated with communist movement. And Cuba today still faces such a very cruel blockade. The consequence of such blockade is transparent. We know how bad it is. And in China, we have a saying that we are tightening our belt to build socialism. In other words, there would be sacrifices. And the Chinese people made huge sacrifices. Even so, even with a robust domestic market, because of the blockade, China didn't have access to advanced technologies from the West. At the time, we know who is advanced. It was the US and Western Europe. And you don't have access to those. You have a very huge disadvantage in making products. And also, even in terms of market, the US, the West, was a major market for the entire world. So for the Bandung countries, even if they're thinking about something different, we want to do something different. We want to have our independent development, which is very different from the colonial model. In reality, they have to still make businesses with the Western powers, even with those very companies, the very people who have been abusing our countries for centuries. We still have to do business with them. I mean, that's the cruel part of history. And the nationalist countries, under nationalist government, they had somewhat access to Western technology, Western markets, but they didn't have internal markets. The socialist countries had internal markets, but they were blocked away, prevented from the Western tech and Western markets. So all those countries face some deep, deep challenges. And eventually, we know from the late 1970s, all the countries started to move towards a different direction, a direction that dismisses national development. Rather, it advocates for some kind of a globalization. Obviously, that is the US-centered globalization, is the old colonial economics system under a new name. But nevertheless, it was a trend that after 1980s, there's all those countries that one after one that started to, be subjected to the U.S. economic dominance. Samir Amin, Dr. Aziz quoted, he called this the computerization of the national bourgeoisie. Obviously, the computerization applies to many different parts of the world. But that was a general trend. But capitalism always creates its own contradictions. It's regardless of your personal subjective feelings or theories, but the contradictions are there. Capitalism remains highly uneven, remains abusive, exploitative. But now, 40 years after the start of neoliberalism, we can see very important differences. The U.S. as the center of that system has been declining, and there's all kinds of signs of declining. Even though in recent years the U.S. can behave rather aggressively on the global stage, but retreating from the center, retreating from its traditional role as the world center, will create aggressiveness. So the aggressiveness of the United States should be interpreted, in my mind, not as a sign of strength, but as a sign of increasing weakness. And that is the center of the system. And the system itself is crumbling. Clearly, neoliberalism as an ideology, as a policy, as something that has been dominating the world for the last 4 decades, is dying very quickly. And the global south, or the third world, is in a very different state. If previously, in the Bandung era, the government leaders, or the great revolutionary heroes, they had the idea, the spirit is with the global south. Like, well, we want to do something different. But the body, the actual economy, is tied up with the old colonial model. So the body and spirit are rather split. But today, it's very different. In terms of trade, in terms of technology, in terms of the market, global south already constitutes more than half of the global economy. And it's in all kinds of measures. The global south as a whole is becoming a new centers or new areas of growth, new areas of development, rather than the West. So I think in that way, we can think about the future. A new Bandung conference, a new Bandung spirit doesn't have to be an all-inclusive agreement that deals with all of our challenges. Think about the 1955 one. It was rather conservative, but it stresses something in common. The common thing is that all the countries suffered from colonialism and will continue to suffer the institutions, all the legacies from that colonialism or the newly created ones. And that is the largest commonality among all the nations, and we can still continue to build on that. Let me just mention one thing before I finish. Even all the names, Asia, Africa, Latin America, these were all names given by Europeans. We didn't know we were Asians, but we were told that we were Asian. But that is fine. The names that they gave us, we would reuse them. We use them in a meaningful way. The same is with the BRICS. With Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, what does it mean? It means nothing. It was an acronym invented by Goldman Sachs analysts. So it was just handy. But eventually, the BRICS acronym would take on a new meaning. It has its own life, and people reinvent it. And we take it seriously, and we recreated all kinds of institutions based on the BRICS. That tells the energy, the innovation, the vitality of the global south, and we can make things done. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Zung. I love that, the idea of reclaiming the language into something that we can use and we can work with. Our final speaker on this panel is Professor Di Conti. Dr. Bruno Mattarello Di Conti. He's from Brazil. He's an associate professor at the Institute of Economics, University of Campinas in Brazil, which he says is a center for critical discourse in the country. He is the coordinator of the BRICS Network University in economics. He was a visiting professor in many universities, including the University Sorbonne, Moscow State University of International Relations in Russia, and others. Over to you, Dr.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Chandru. Thanks, Farwa, for inviting me, and for all the organizers. I'd like to congratulate you for this very important and timely meeting. I'm very happy to be here. I'll have a PPT, and then here it goes. So what I will do here is I'm going to present some ideas that I developed with a co-author, and which is in the next slide. You can see it was published recently in the New Political Economy journal. We can go to the article. And the idea is discussing and conceptualizing what we named as the International Division of Finance. We can move ahead. We can go to the next slide, please. As an analogy, obviously, to the International Division of Labor, which has been discussed in economics since the very origin of what we know as modern economics by David Ricardo, which said that finally countries should specialize, as you know, in their endowment, in the sectors where they had advantages, and then the international trade would bring equal benefits for everybody. And then we started having critical views on that with Marx, and later on with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, in Latin America. And they, in the next slide, they developed a very powerful theory, this school, which later became known as the Latin American structuralism. We can go to the next slide, please. has many problems in terms of also the proposals they made, but they have a very powerful diagnosis on how the international capitalism works, especially by understanding that, well, obviously we have a center and a periphery, but more than that, understanding that the interaction between these two poles of capitalism do not take the global south or the underdeveloped countries into the position of the developed countries. It's rather the contrary. We are not developing countries. We are underdeveloped countries, Brazil, Sri Lanka, and the global south. We are underdeveloped countries, and it's not a matter of maturity and time for us to reach development. Because obviously underdevelopment and development, they not only coexist, but they complement each other. Actually, underdevelopment is not a stage for development. It's not a deviation of the development process, but this is like capitalism works. The modus operandi of capitalism works with development and underdevelopment, and the underdeveloped countries have a function for the developed countries. They are both sides of one coin, right? The periphery is functional to the development of the center. Then we go to the next slide. And then this idea was developed in mid-20th century, especially focusing on the division between agricultural countries and industrial countries. But our claim is that the central elements of this idea, this conceptual framework, are still valid, obviously requiring some updates. One of them is that, well, the international division of labor changed. So nowadays we don't have any more peripheral countries only producing agricultural goods. We have Vietnam, we have Mexico, we have many peripheral countries which are doing industrial goods, but they are in some positions in the division of labor which are still those with low technology, with low value added. So that there is a whole need to reconceptualize the international division of labor. But, and here is our point, we have next slide please, we have to understand and update this theory by understanding that we are now living in a financialized capitalism, right? Next slide. And this 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒔, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, back in 1949, they highlighted only this productive technological dimension of the peripherality, right? Why? Because we were under Bretton Woods system, so with constraints to the financial flows, so they highlighted this productive technological dimension of peripherality. But there was already in 1965, and we have other examples, but a critical voice from Africa, he was mentioned by one of my colleagues, Kwame Nkrumah, in this very interesting book. He is one of those who already in the 60s was already talking about finance as one of the most important vectors of neocolonialism, right? So even for countries which were independent, they had to deal with new colonialism, and one of the vectors for neocolonialism was precisely through finance. Chandru mentioned some issues related to that. And then if we come to our current era, even more, so we are talking about digitalization, about Bitcoin, we have those far-right wing governments in Latin America, and Donald Trump, and the weaponization of the US dollar. So this whole discussion about the asymmetries of the international monetary and financial system and the consequences to the periphery of the world are even more relevant today than they were in the last century. Let's move ahead. That's why we try to understand that it's useful to conceptualize this idea of the international division of finance in an analogy to the international division of labor. Let's move ahead. And what's the idea? Well, there is a structural differentiation between the center and the periphery, and there is a functionality of the periphery to the center when we look into the modus operandi of the international monetary and financial system nowadays. So we have to look into the qualitative differences of the currencies and financial assets which compose the international monetary and financial system, understanding again that those differences are not something related again to the maturity, to the timing of the different countries of the world, but they are constructed in a qualitatively different way in order for the periphery to function, to be dependent and functioning to the center. Let's move ahead. So this is those are the differences for the International Division of Labor, coming back, so I already mentioned it. Even nowadays, even nowadays, if we don't have the dichotomy anymore between agricultural and industrial countries, we do have dichotomies, right? So the center is still, it is the smile curve for those who know it. The center is in the tasks which are high value added, high technology, and the periphery low value added, low technology. And if we move, now we can go to the International Division of Finance. The next slide. We also have very important differences and qualitative differences. So the center is the place where, first of all, investors, they will raise funds, right? So liabilities for investments all over the world, and they offer the assets which are aimed at maintaining the wealth and defending the wealth in moments of crisis. Whereas the periphery, next slide, offers the assets and currencies which enable, first of all, the diversification of the international investors' portfolios, and relatedly, the valorization and recompositing of these portfolios' profitability. So in very clear terms, the center offers liquidity and safety, the safe haven, and the periphery offers the assets which can be considered as riskier, but which will offer high yields, potentially offer high yields, right? Let's move ahead. So this is just to show that finally it's part of the international liquidity cycles, because then investors all over the world, they, in moments of appetite for the risk, they go in the direction of less liquid assets, riskier assets, and they are prone to invest in Brazil with Rio, in Argentina with peso, in India or Sri Lanka with rupee, and so on and so forth. But then when eventually there is a change in the mood of the international markets, and normally this change is alien to the periphery, it happens because of things related to US market or European market, then there is a flight for liquidity. And then obviously those peripheral assets are the first assets to be abandoned in a quest for liquid assets, the central currencies and assets issued in the central currency, in the central countries. This movement is not individual, it's collective. So it constitutes, at the end of the day, what we name as the international liquidity cycles, right? What the literature names as the international liquidity cycles. So, and then there are beautiful names for this process. So the investors, they name emerging markets. So Brazil is an emerging market. And then now they have this new concept. You probably saw it already. The IMF uses it as well. The new frontier markets. So markets where investors can search for higher yields. Next slide. It's very interesting in doing research. I found this paper which comes from the Harvard Business Review. So it's not at all a critical paper, it's the contrary. But you can see the figure they use to talk about these new frontier markets. Caravels. It could be understood as a cartoon, a critical cartoon at progressive international website or whatever, but no, it comes from the Harvard Business Review. It's not at all a critical cartoon, and it shows caravels, you see. So in talking about the frontier economies, they show caravels. So even themselves, they know that it is related to what was done previously with colonialism. And then we can imagine that it has less blood and less violence, but it is embedded in structural violence, as was mentioned as well. So it's a new kind of, it's part of neocolonialism. Let's move ahead. And it has blood and it has violence because it has harsh consequences for the periphery of the world. So the center has this exorbitant privilege, this expression which was coined by Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in the 60s already. The US has a lot of privileges related to the fact that they issue the key currency of the world. And next slide, for the periphery, it has a lot of negative consequences, obviously, which can be summarized in those three. Dependency on the international financial cycles, lack of autonomy for economic policy, and high external vulnerability, even if this external vulnerability nowadays is different from the one we had in the 50s in last century. Let's move ahead. And they are all burdens associated to the functionality. So again, it's not a deviation, it's not a problem of maturity. It works like this. It's related to the functionality of peripheral countries to the core countries in this dimension of the peripherality, the monetary financial dimension. Let's move ahead. So, and it has also some structural trends, and again we do an analogy with the International Division of Labor. You all know the trends which come from the International Division of Labor, the unequal exchange, deterioration in the terms of trade, and then when we go into the empirics of the International Division of Finance, we can see that there is a structurally a net transfer of wealth from peripheral to central economies through those financial channels. Let's move ahead. We did an empirical work. I won't bother you with that. But trying to see the international investment positions of core and peripheral countries and the yields generated through that, and also the capital gains in the periphery and in the center for both the external assets and external liabilities. You can go in the paper if you want. Next slide. But, you cannot see it, sorry about that. But you can trust me. The first line in the top is the yields for the liabilities of the peripheral countries, and the other one with the arrow is the cost of liabilities in the center. And very clearly, obviously, and this is for 2003 to 2023, for almost all countries in the world. And then obviously the liabilities for the center is around 2.5%, and for the periphery it reaches almost 6% a year. Okay, it reached 8, now it's 6. And here again you cannot see the numbers, but we did this analysis also for yields, but also capital gains, assets and liabilities. And then for the central countries, the differential is positive, obviously. And then for the periphery, it was -5, so it's negative. Showing this, next slide, please. This structural trend of transfer of wealth from the periphery to the center, which combined to the structural trend related to the International Division of Labor, creates what we name as a double capture of wealth, both through the productive technological dimension and the monetary financial dimension. Let's move ahead. And then I arrive to my final remarks. Obviously, what we are trying to do here, what I'm trying to do here, is an analytical work. So you are making this distinction between the international division or the peripherality in the financial monetary dimension and the technological productive dimension for the sake of our analytical work. But obviously, the periphery has to be understood as a whole, and the functions it provides to the center also have to be understood both through the two dimensions. And the point is that the periphery has this functionality to the center, which is to potentialize the process of accumulation of wealth in the center. Let's move ahead. And then my very final slide, what to do, right? And then obviously we can deal with that nationally in our countries, in Brazil, in Sri Lanka, in India, capital controls, public banks, those are important things to do. But we have to think, and this is where the Bandung spirit comes, we have to do also joint struggles. The Global South has to be united against all kinds of exploitation, including these asymmetries of the international monetary and financial system. So all efforts have to for de-dollarization of the world system, for new platforms for payments in national currencies. Maybe this tendency of transformation of the form of money into digital money may be an opportunity for us to create platforms for payments in national currencies. We have to struggle for reforms in the international financial institutions, but also create our institutions, right? The BRICS institutions, other Global South institutions. Combat to the absurd power of credit rating agencies and so on and so forth. So this is a whole front of struggles, this is my claim, that we should have together as Global South countries. And I finish here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Conte. I think that brought us to all the possible aspects of how we can actually mobilize the Bandung spirit, right? From the political to the transnationalism and the whole conversation around knowledge, the growth of people's, workers' power, the idea of militarization, the whole idea of growing alternative centers in the global south, and finally to the very vexing issue of international division of finance. So I think that's been a really fruitful set of presentations. I think we've all learned a lot. I certainly have. We have now about 15 minutes for looking at questions, which you might be having, I'm sure. You can direct them to any particular speaker, or you can ask them generally. Let's take about 3 questions at a start, and then have our panelists respond to them. So, do we have mics around the floor? Please identify yourself and you ask the question. Thank you.
I'm 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒔 𝑨𝒇𝒕𝒅𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒅, a student of international relations and law. So one of the key concepts behind all the lectures of all the panelists were to unlearn the concepts taught by the liberal world order. So what are the alternatives that you provide to what should we learn instead of the concepts provided by the liberal world order?
Good question. Anyone else got some more? Yes.
Hello everyone, I'm Amasha Fernando, a second year undergraduate at the Department of International Relations at the University of Colombo. So my question is actually related to the question asked previously. So when we look at the Bandung Conference and mainly at the international order at that time, one particular salient feature that I can see is the moral power in the global south. We actually were very united with each other in a time span where proxy wars were going on, and there was a clear-cut division between 2 blocks in the world. So in that essence, we had this moral power where we were there for each other in proxy war situations and maybe economic collapses. So my question is, we can use that kind of international moral power. So we have many modes of power with soft power and hard power, but this special aspect of moral power can be used to come out of our issues with dollarization and de-dollarization as well. Because although we have focused on political aspects, particularly in the Bandung Conference, the frameworks can be used up to date to contribute to the economic issues that we have. So at a moral ground, we can unite. So what can we do in that sense? So how can we develop from that aspect, taking examples from the Bandung Conference in particular?
Thank you.
So much.
Dr. Kalintama, do you want to just
To some extent, this is the best of times and the worst of times, because it's the best of times because the US is demonstrating such chaos in leadership that mirage has, I think, been I know it's a mirage, or the veneer has been undermined. But it's also the worst of time because the other countries have not used this to have any kind of solidarity to negotiate together. They have not used this. Each one has gone separately to get a little deal for themselves. But if we stood back and thought, how can they negotiate as a bloc, not just China because it's big or India because it's big, and rather than doing it independently, this could have been an opportunity, and we're missing that. And I don't know whether that can be reignited.
Thank you. One more question from the back, and then we give our panelists a chance to.
I think I want to pose this question to Dr. Bruno. My name is Dileepa. I'm a rights activist as well as advocate for education reform and particularly decolonizing education. My question is inspired by what you said about International Division of Labor and the link in the Global South to the brain drain. Because many countries, including Sri Lanka is suffering a lot from this as we speak, where our public education system produces high-skilled professionals, and then many of them leave the country to the global north. So then this idea of International Division of Labor doesn't really work in the sense because it doesn't benefit the global south at all. We seem to be producing professionals that eventually migrate to the global north, and then therefore we are not benefiting from what we spend money on. So what should we do about it? That's my question.
Thank you. Let's take those 4 questions. Is there anybody? Okay, all right. Dr. Phal, would you like to answer any of those questions, if any? Are we okay with the technology there? Okay? All right. Go on. You can ask. We've had 4 questions. One was about, yes, we have to unlearn certain things. So what do we replace that with, right? What do we learn? There was a question about the moral power. I don't know whether Dr. Kadirgamma was actually making a question or just a comment, but it was more like this is the best of times and the worst of times, and how do we actually capitalize on this moment? And then there was the last question, which was about the brain drain and how does that relate to the International Division of Labor, right?
Indeed.
You don't have to answer all 4. You can just choose whichever one you'd feel like you want to answer.
It's very tempting to try again, but basically what I have noticed first is that this issue of brain gain should oppose also on brain gain. And so it's a brain drain and a brain gain movement. But as I mentioned it earlier, there is no recognition of the contribution of the Global South in the general knowledge. And if we have this system of debunking how knowledge is built on the world system, and if we consider that all the youth have the right to move anywhere they want to be, at least in the Global South, if the North doesn't accept, we can allow circulation of knowledge, at least in the Global South, if we have another conception of morality, because this issue of morality is the issue of ethics. Normally, most of mankind have invented religions because, in fact, our ethics are weak. But if we accept that we can have a system of morality that is universal, that's why I was referring to understanding the origin and the homeomorphic examples of other conception of worldview elsewhere, if we can reconcile that, then we can build a new form of universalist system. And this is based on ethics and moral, but it needs to be the contribution also of the global South. The idea of liberty, like you have not chosen to be born, so liberty, you there haven't chosen to die. Those are, freedom is something that is restricted, but idea of equality is something more interesting. So if we put this at the cornerstone of our struggle, if we put solidarity, we can achieve those type of those progress. Now it may sound very utopian for the youth, and as Dr. Xu have explained, those consensual 10 principles that was raised in Bandung in 55 seems mild compared to what we are facing today. Just for the issue of defending the commons, all the public goods, just the issue of defending the earth that is in danger. And you remember how it was during the pandemic, that where we really see that we were lacking morals and ethics in terms of defending global health. So basically what I'm just saying is that all those concepts are useless if we don't actually understand the progressive potential that is still lying into the spirit of this Bandung efforts. But that's why I was saying that it has lost its breath, and I'm calling for another stage, which I call Bandung Second, or trans-internationalism, where we can reinvent and like it's a fresh page. I'm just coming from Argentina, and I was struck there that most of the elite are still considering themselves Europeans, and they look with despite to the other Latin American. While in fact, if you remember, when they were fighting against Britain for the Falkland, so-called Malwines, the whole South was with them. So instead of accepting their geographical but also historic grounding in the global South, they look themselves are one of the United States province. So this is where we have to re-educate, I think, our system of thought. And I trust the new generation, the young generation, accept to be planet citizens, and particularly accept their participation in a global South endeavor. And this is something that we can learn, like we Africans can learn from Sri Lanka, from Vietnam, from Brazil, and exchange knowledge. For example, we can defend biodiversity. In my region, for example, we have 3,000 plants. At least 600 have been already patented by multinationals like Pfizer and Coca-Cola, etc. Those are common goods that we need to defend, you know. So anyway, I think we have great deal to learn. We have to learn from China. We have to learn from internationalists like Norman Bichun, who is a Canadian who went there during the Spanish War and then went to China. So those are the spirits that are still alive with the idea of ethics. And I do believe that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just need to know history and know exactly where we go. There is maybe no camino, you know, there is no way as such, but the horizon should not be closed for the new generation. And this is where we are very anxious with this new technology, that the youth don't necessarily have the capacity of recognizing what is left from right in the internet, for example, what is disinformation and information, what type of skills that you need to have to be able to be armed with science, because science is the only option, a progressive science with open mind and a critic understanding of reality and history.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the very interesting questions. And then I will start with the one related to solidarity, because it's very true that in situations of crisis, we can have a push for solidarity, but we can also have a push for nationalism, right? And this is what is happening in many countries in the world, including my country, Brazil, which had Bolsonaro, which was a nightmare. But I do believe that we have a very strong push for solidarity. and I'll tell you why. We had, with the pandemic, unveiled the total failure, and there is no other word for that, of the global governance, right? When you see the scandal of the distribution of vaccination, for instance, it's a total failure, the global governance. And so it shows the need to reform, and what I would say is that, so this axis of inequality is one of the axes which is very critical nowadays and which cannot be faced nationally, and the other one is the ecological crisis, right? The ecological crisis by definition cannot be dealt with nationally. So either we face it collectively or we will perish collectively. So I would say is that we have to, I don't know what will happen. Maybe nationalism will prevail, maybe a war will prevail, but we as militants, I would say that we have to stick in these two axes, facing inequality and facing the ecological crisis as the core of the need for solidarity. When and coming back to the brain drain and the immigration, when Europeans talk about immigration crisis, or when the US talk about immigration crisis, it is a total, it's totally misconceptualized, in my opinion, because it's not an immigration crisis, it's a crisis of inequality. And then, as is said, it's obviously that with the current inequalities we have, people, young generations, will want to go abroad to other countries, right? So to deal with this multi-dimensional crisis, we have to, in my opinion, go into the core of it, which is related to inequality and to the ecological crisis, which both combined create the humanitarian crisis we are living. And so this is why I believe that in spite of all problems and nationalism wing movements we have in the world, we can try to get united and change the situation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the very important questions. The ability to negotiate as a bloc, and in a way all three questions are about the system of capitalism that we all operate under.
Of the capital in each country. And we can start from there. I just think. And we can start from there. I just thank you.
Okay, very briefly, two quick points. The first one is on this being the best of times and can we get South solidarity. You know, one of the problems with the embrace of neoliberalism, because of the fact that you couldn't generate independent national development strategies, which was the promise at the time when Bandung was held, is that it results in a situation where countries compete with each other to get a foothold in external markets. You don't develop your own market, so you need a foothold in external markets. So you suppress your wages domestically to become competitive. You try to compete with others in order to occupy the available space in global markets to the extent that it's open for you. And therefore, you're constantly in a world of divide. So in some sense, you know, we can't take the issue of solidarity out of the economic context in which it is embedded, which in part the Bandung Declaration did. If we actually locate it within the economic context, then we have to say that unless you have strategies pursued which gives national independence, and independent sovereign governments come together to stand up against imperialism, you actually would find it difficult to build substantial South-South solidarity. Which answers partly the question, so what is the alternative? The first, of course, is we must build our national markets in order to be able to have some kind of independent development. In smaller countries, we have to do it by having a sort of common market across countries, for which we need South-South solidarity. To do that, we need to address economic and asset inequality. To address asset inequality, you're basically saying that you not only need progressive fiscal policies, tax and redistribution measures, but you also need a direct attack on forms of monopoly which you think undermine progress and growth. And till such time as you can achieve it, the least we can do is to guarantee to our people universal access to food, to education, to health. There must be some minimums, including, of course, some degree of social protection in the case of old age and disability. At least that much we must guarantee today as we fight to actually ensure that we can have national development which allows for South-South solidarity.
Thank you. I think we are actually out of time, but I will take 2 questions, maybe just one from here, right in front. Someone's got the mic.
Yeah.
There's the woman with bright red earrings. That's the next one. And then we'll take one from this side. Okay. So 3 questions.
Yeah. My question is like when we are talking about new Bandung spirits, or like we are talking about new NAM, so how we can like go for like grassroots driven kind of people-centric initiative for this aspect, like because we know like the current world order is like very dynamic and it's increasing multipolar system, and also the some powers like who are in the world, like they are also considering as global south. So within that context, like how we can like separate these aspects and how we can like construct a new structure or something if we are going forward in this path.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers for really thought-provoking presentations. I wanted to ask Professor Chandrasekhar about a comment, and I'm sorry if I've misinterpreted what you said or if I'm reducing your analysis. But you mentioned that one of the reasons why the Bandung movement didn't have a linear development where it transformed the world order was possibly because the state didn't emerge as a bulwark for capitalism, a state which has the people's interests at its core. As Sri Lankans are also finding out after the last election, isn't that a rather overly positive view of the liberal state right now? Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm 𝒂𝒑. I'm a law student from the University of Colombo. My question to the panel is, especially in the modern context with a lot of conflicts around the world, do you think that there is sort of a possibility of world leaders coming onto one single desk and discussing a policy for the entire globe? Let's say South-South nations at the moment, if we look at the Indo-Pakistan conflict and then the Israel-Palestine conflict, we've seen a lot of countries being divided in opinion. So in that sort of a context, would it be possible for countries to come to a single desk and discuss these issues that are very much important to us at the moment? And also, in line with this, how do you see the global order changing if there is sort of room for for the non-aligned movement to, let's say, re-emerge in this current context? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the panel. We're going to start from Professor Chandrasekhar on this end, but just to say, answer the questions, and then maybe if you have a final remark that you think has not been addressed, just to make that as well.
Okay, yeah, you didn't overly misrepresent me at all, so that's okay. But let me explain. So I'm not saying that if actually the people, because of the fact that they experience distress, a crisis, etc., put in place a state, that state would automatically necessarily be of a kind that will, I mean, we know what happened in Greece, for example, and people voted to put Syriza in power. It had a very clear mandate to do certain things. The finance minister quit, Yanis Varoufakis, because of the fact that Syriza wouldn't do what it promised its people that it would do. So now the thing is, there are 2 ways we can interpret it. One, of course, we have to recognize that sometimes these states come to power in the context of a legacy of subordination which makes them vulnerable. So if you have a large amount of foreign capital accumulated in your stock markets, for example, or your bond markets, you're worried that if you do something, there will be a flight of capital. Now the point is to therefore build over a period of time an ability to be able to address that flight or the consequences of that flight, and also have the social sanction to get people to agree that there would be a period in which they have to take a sacrifice in order for you to be able to reshape the agenda the way they want you to reshape it. So there is an international context. There is an imperialism. We can't write that off, which actually constrains even progressive states which are voted to power. But the other is that, we shouldn't take only one or two examples. I've given an extreme example, but we know examples in Latin America. We know examples where there have been governments which have come and have gone part of the way. And as he said, things don't necessarily happen in one day. But the point is, in the process of trying to do what you should do, you actually then mobilize a set of forces which can actually give material form and substance to these ideas which are transformative. And that's what we're looking for. And that's the only thing we can constantly try and do, is to keep hoping that in this process of moving forward step by step, you would actually bring the transformation needed to get yourself not merely a more egalitarian order, but solidarity which undermines imperialism in the long run.
I didn't really have much to add to what Professor Chandrasekhar said, but I just mentioned one thing, that if imperialism serves as a major external constraint for whatever progressive policies that we can do in the global South, that constraint, I think, is in the process of weakening. As we all mentioned about this, so I think we can be a little bit more optimistic looking forward, that in 10 years, in 20 years, that we would be in a very different kind of global situation, where a lot of unimaginable policies, unimaginable actions will become viable, feasible, something quite likely to happen. So that's, thank you.
Thank you. I also don't have much to add, because professors already mentioned that. But just on the point on possibilities, the reason why I was mentioning militancy is because it is ultimately the last resort. People use their bodies because they don't have any other means of doing so. And when they do that in a generational cycle, I think it becomes something much bigger and larger, as we see in those coalitions. And therefore, we must also always account for this struggle. The Vietnam War lasted for 40 years, and the US could not stand up to ordinary Vietnamese. And this is something we must always remember when we speak of possibilities.
Very good questions again, but obviously I'd like only to touch some issues related to the grassroots movements. Actually, in my exposition and in many analyses here, we are trying to use this divide between global north and global south, which is very useful in my opinion, because there is an exploitation from the global south done by the global north, obviously. But we have to go into, and it was mentioned as well, at the end of the day, we have also always to discuss the social struggles which happen in each country, right? So obviously in my country, in Brazil, in many peripheral countries, there is an elite, this comprador elite, which also takes benefit, for instance, of the International Division of Finance. So they are in favor of Milei in Argentina with the dollarization and so on and so forth. So that's why it cannot be done, real transformations cannot be done without grassroots movements in each of those countries, both in global north and south. I totally agree. And then if we can have a global policy, it's a very good question, but the answer is that it would be the ideal situation, but it's very, very hard, right? And when we are living this humanitarian crisis, and then the solution to the humanitarian crisis, which is provided by the global north, for the ecological crisis, for instance, in some cases, it's a total shame, right? When they say that the solution for the climate change is electric vehicle. it's a joke. I mean, they are trying to, they will get less pollution in Europe or the US, but with pollution and minings in Africa or in Latin America, right? So, so if we do not agree on a global policy, and it's very unlikely we will do it, it shows us even more the need to have at least a kind of a consensus in the global south, right? And then regional alliances are very important, and if we cannot have the whole global south having more and more countries involved in these movements for concrete transformations, is already something, right?
Well, yes, quickly on this global governance issue and on people-centric. As you know, the multilateral system is not working because those who built it no longer need it, as it was built as a reproduction system of the world capitalist system. The non-aligned movement actually led to the advent of the Group of 77 in a truncated multilateral system. And the response was international cooperation, which never reached the 0.7 of ODA. So the triad, United States and Japan mainly, and Europe, never really respect that. And their response was to create the G3, then the G5, then the G7, then the G8, and finally G20. The G20 is attempting to regulate the international order without having the authority to do so. Many civil societies are protesting. Civil societies, to show you how it's important to repoliticize our masses, civil societies organize an anti-imperialist people's court, like during the November 2024 G20 activity. It was called a Popular Anti-Imperialist Tribunal, which brought together thousands of people at the Fundación Progreso, which is a historic place in Rio de Janeiro, to judge 6 cases, among them Palestine, Haiti, the United States-Mercosur Agreement of crimes in the presence of those who affected lawyers and judges. So in fact, all the peoples and nations that have suffered colonization and continue to suffer its after effects must learn to work together to emerge from their condition. And this is why a people-centric approach is so important, to not leave the decision-making to leaders. There was a world summit, maybe you have witnessed, a world summit that was called by UN to see whether the leader of the world would be able to save mankind. And it was a failure. So it is important that citizens, not consumers, but citizens, with consciousness, like understanding what is the gravity of the situation and the emergency. And this is why the anti-systemic zone, which is this global south, have a privilege to express this capacity of South-South cooperation at all levels, bilateral, multilateral, or simply as citizens. And this is why we should never, never underestimate the scope and the magnitude of any of our contribution, like even the tiny, tiny person, like the drop of rain or any drop in the sea. All people are important. And even though it is not considered as important people in the global north, you can see when we have casualties in Palestine or, people dying in the global south, no one really pay attention. I'm not mentioning Africa. But we know that we are all important. And once we understand that, and that united we can really confront the system, once we realize that, I think it's almost impossible to stop the tide. And because they know exactly the power of the people. When people unite, imperialism trembles.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really good note on which to end. It brings back also another concept that I think was prevalent during that time of Bandung, which is the whole idea of conscientization of citizens. So I think that's really a really important aspect. Tomorrow you will be able to kind of have panels that look into some of these questions more deeply. So we have a panel on crisis planning and industrial policy. We have a panel on decolonization, the Bandung spirit, and the new international economic order. And we have a final panel on new multilateralism, South-South solidarity, and alternatives. So if you couldn't ask any questions here, I'm sure you will either find the answers or get a chance to ask them later. Thank you very much for your engagement. Let us give our panel a round of applause and as a thank you for being with us. And have a good evening, everyone.
No, you are very good. In the of economics section. It combined the personal.